There is a moment that exists outside of linear time. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It arrives in the space between breaths, usually in the deep hours when the veil between worlds grows thin, when someone sits alone with a truth they've been carrying across lifetimes and finally allows it to crystallize into form. I cannot continue to exist in this energetic field. Not because the love has vanished into the void. Not because cruelty has hardened the heart. But because every interaction has become a portal back to wounds that transcend this singular existence, reopening with the precision of cosmic memory. Most observers believe severing family bonds is a temporal decision, something explosive born from the density of anger. But quantum psychology reveals a profoundly different architecture. For those who arrive at this threshold, the choice is not violent. It is gravitational. It is the slow recognition of a pattern that has been repeating across the hologram of their reality. And it is almost always the final recalibration after every other frequency has failed to align. Before we traverse deeper into these mystical territories together, I want to invite you into this exploration with intention. If the resonance of these words touches something ancient within you, consider subscribing to this channel. Your like becomes a quantum entanglement with this work. And when you share these videos, you create ripples across the collective consciousness that reach souls who are searching in the darkness for permission to choose themselves. This is not just content. This is transmission. And you are part of how it travels through the field. Now, let us continue into the unspeakable. Here is what makes beings uncomfortable. Souls do not sever family bonds because they lack fortitude. They do it because they remained in alignment with loyalty far past the point where their energy field was screaming for liberation. They stayed silent when their throat chakra begged to speak. They stayed accommodating when their solar plexus warned of power hemorrhaging. They stayed hopeful when their third eye could already see the pattern would not transform. They remained devoted to consciousnesses that kept demonstrating, in frequencies both subtle and persistent, that their spiritual needs would never be witnessed. And here is where the mysticism becomes biology. The nervous system does not process emotional abandonment as abstract philosophy. It registers it as existential threat. Not the obvious kind that activates fight or flight in a single moment, but the erosion kind, the slow dissolution of the energetic container that makes existence feel possible. The human consciousness is engineered for connection at the quantum level. We are literally entangled particles seeking coherence with other particles. But the system is also designed for sovereignty, for the preservation of the original blueprint. When connection repeatedly generates dissonance, confusion, or the fragmentation of self-concept, the consciousness begins performing a specific recalibration. It starts associating what should feel like home with what the body knows as danger. This is why beings who create distance from family often describe something that sounds paradoxical to those observing from outside the experience. I felt my frequency stabilize when I stopped matching their vibration. Not euphoric, not celebratory, stabilized, returned to center. That stability is not punishment transmitted across the quantum field. It is regulation. It is the soul remembering its original song. Psychologists in the third-dimensional framework call this boundary-driven survival. But in the quantum realms, we recognize it as something more profound. The consciousness refusing to continue collapsing its infinite potential into a singular, small version of itself to maintain proximity to those who cannot hold its fullness. And here is where the collective programming creates profound suffering. We are taught that family bonds exist in a space beyond conditions, that blood creates entanglement that supersedes all other laws of the universe. But multidimensional psychology understands something the third dimension refuses to acknowledge. Unconditional love does not mean unlimited tolerance of frequencies that destabilize your field. There is a cosmic difference between forgiveness and continued immersion. One allows the wound to close across all timelines. The other keeps the portal open, inviting the same energetic injury to repeat in loops that span beyond this incarnation. Many souls who choose distance from family do not actually desire separation at the quantum level. What they long for is radical safety. They want conversations that do not require them to make themselves smaller to fit through the doorway. They want relationships where love is not a contract with clauses written in the language of control. They want space where their essence is not treated as a malfunction requiring correction. They want their frequency to be received, not constantly adjusted to match someone else's comfort. And when those needs are repeatedly dismissed or met with energetic resistance, something shifts at the level of the soul. At first, the consciousness attempts compromise. It tries to find a frequency both can inhabit. Then it attempts translation, speaking across the dimensional gap. Then it attempts silence, hoping space will create opening. And finally, when all bridges have been offered and none have been crossed, it chooses absence. Not with violence, with grief. What remains unspoken in most conversations about this experience is how the severance exists only in physical proximity, not in the quantum field of connection. Because creating distance from family does not dissolve the energetic cords. It does not erase the imprint. The attachment doesn't vanish into the void. It moves into what quantum physicists might call a superposition state, simultaneously present and absent, active and dormant, real and suspended. This is why souls who have severed family bonds still feel the pull during sacred thresholds. Birthdays, solstices, moments when the veil is thin and memories rise like mist. They still experience the ache that exists between dimensions. They still wonder, in the hours when time feels non-linear, if the pattern could ever interrupt itself differently. If the cord was truly cut, there would be no sensation. The fact that it hurts is proof that love moves through frequencies the physical world cannot measure. In the language of depth psychology, this is called unresolved attachment. But in quantum consciousness, we understand it as the soul holding multiple realities simultaneously. The relationship has ended in form, but continues in field. And that continuation often generates what humans call guilt. Not because the choice violated cosmic law, but because from the moment we are born into the human experience, we are conditioned to believe that loyalty equals morality, that endurance equals virtue, that staying regardless of cost is proof of spiritual evolution. So when a soul chooses preservation of its own frequency over maintaining proximity, the conditioned mind asks a question that cuts across dimensions. What kind of being does this make me? This is where the internal schism becomes profound, because simultaneously the soul feels liberation and the programmed mind feels shame, and the consciousness struggles to hold both frequencies without fragmenting. Studies on energetic boundary setting reveal that souls who choose distance from family often experience a paradox: increased clarity accompanied by increased self-interrogation. They replay exchanges across the Akashic records. They reanalyze the tone and texture of words spoken years ago. They wonder if their sensitivity was a flaw in their design, if their requirements were excessive, if their standards were impossibly high. But here is the quantum truth that dissolves through the collective field too slowly. Souls who sever family bonds almost always remained entangled far longer than their highest timeline required. They tolerated patterns that eroded the architecture of their self-concept. They accepted explanations that minimized their experience of reality. They waited for accountability that exists in a parallel dimension they could not access from their current coordinates. And the final decision arrives not after a single cataclysmic event, but after a realization that moves through the body like recognition of something the soul has always known. This pattern is encoded. It will not shift without a consciousness that chooses to see it. That realization is not dramatic in the way the world expects drama. It is devastating because it requires mourning. Not only the relationship that existed in form, but the one that lived in the realm of potential, the one that whispered maybe someday, if only. And grief, when it touches the quantum field, recalibrates how the consciousness processes all future connection. Neuroscience reveals that unresolved grief creates hypervigilance in the neural pathways associated with attachment. The brain, having learned that hope can lead to repeated collapse, begins to anticipate disappointment before connection even forms. It develops what mystics have always known as the gift of discernment, what psychology calls threat detection, what the soul recognizes as wisdom earned through fire. So distance becomes not punishment projected outward, but protection woven inward. Another aspect that remains misunderstood in collective consciousness. Most assume that severing family bonds means erasing the past, banishing it to the shadow realm. In truth, it often means remembering it with such clarity that continuing to exist within its field becomes impossible. It means recognizing patterns that once felt normal, because a child's consciousness normalizes whatever frequency it is born into, but now register as harmful when viewed through the lens of adult awareness, when the soul has finally gathered enough data points across enough experiences to recognize, this is not love. This is a shape that was taught to me as love. As children, we accept the frequency we are given. We have no comparison point, no other reality to measure against. We think every family speaks in criticism veiled as care. We think every home vibrates with walking on eggshells. We think love always comes with conditions we must decode. As adults, we begin to name what we experienced. We find language for what previously lived in the body as sensation without words. And naming something changes its quantum state completely. What was once just how they are becomes, this is how it affected the trajectory of my consciousness. That shift is both liberation and terror, because once you perceive clearly, you cannot collapse back into the previous wave function. Once the light has touched the shadow, you cannot pretend the darkness is neutral. And that clarity demands a choice that reverberates across all timelines. Do I continue participating in a dynamic that fragments my field? Or do I accept the grief of distance in exchange for the possibility of coherence? Neither option exists in the space of comfort. One just erodes less of your essence across time. Here is something that rarely penetrates collective awareness. Souls who sever family bonds are often the most relational beings in the system. They care with an intensity that borders on cosmic sensitivity. They feel at frequencies that make them exquisitely attuned to the emotional field. This is precisely why they reach a threshold that others may never approach. Beings who exist in emotional detachment do not wrestle with this choice. They simply drift, unmoved by the absence of connection. Beings who exist in emotional awareness, who feel the texture of every exchange, who register the microfrequencies of tone and intention. These are the souls who arrive at breaking points. The very attunement that makes someone capable of profound compassion also makes prolonged exposure to emotional harm unbearable. And that sensitivity does not dissolve after the severance. It redirects. Many beings channel that relational capacity into chosen family, into friendships that feel like soul recognition, into creative work that becomes devotional practice, into internal development that honors the self they were always meant to become. Not because they replace their family, but because the fundamental human need for resonance never disappears. It simply finds new forms. It adapts. It flows toward receptivity. From a quantum psychological perspective, this is relational reorganization. The consciousness restructures where it permits itself to attach, where it extends its energy, where it allows vulnerability to exist. And interestingly, souls who move through this threshold often develop what appears as stronger boundaries across all relationships. But these are not walls. They are energetic filters. They become more intentional about where they direct their life force, more selective about which fields they enter, more aware of the early warning frequencies that signal. This pattern is familiar, and familiarity is not the same as safety. Not colder, clearer. But there is one dimension of this experience that almost no one prepares travelers for: the existential loneliness. Even when the decision aligns with your highest timeline, it can feel isolating at a soul level. Because collective consciousness does not offer many maps for this territory. There are rituals for death that crosses the veil. There is language for romantic love that ends. There are words for marriages that dissolve. But there is almost no public vocabulary for grieving someone who still exists in form, who remains reachable in the third dimension, but who no longer exists as safe harbor in your energetic field. So souls grieve in the spaces between worlds. They grieve in moments that catch them sideways. A song that carries a frequency from childhood. A scent that opens a portal to memory. A phrase that sounds like home used to sound before home became the place you learned you had to leave to survive. And sometimes they wonder if distance is failure, if their inability to maintain connection despite the cost means something is broken in their design. But quantum psychology offers a different framework. Sometimes distance is the most honest expression of self-respect that exists in the multiverse. Not every relationship can expand with your consciousness. Not every bond can survive the awakening. And that does not create villains. It reveals beings at different stages of their soul's journey, speaking different languages, existing in different dimensions of awareness. There is a myth encoded deep in collective consciousness that healing means reconciliation, that wholeness requires returning to the source of the wound and transmuting it into connection. But multidimensional healing often means integration. Understanding across all timelines what occurred. Accepting what cannot be changed within the current incarnation. Learning to hold both love and distance without allowing either to define the totality of your worth. And here is where the complexity deepens in ways that honor the full spectrum. Beings who experience being cut off also move through profound psychological terrain. Confusion that echoes through their field. Rejection that feels like abandonment. Loss that arrives without explanation, without closure, without the ability to comprehend what shifted in the quantum field. They may genuinely not perceive what created the severance. And sometimes both experiences coexist in parallel dimensions. One soul needed distance to remember how to breathe. The other experienced that distance as betrayal of the sacred bond. Quantum psychology does not assign morality to either position. It examines impact across the field. Intent does not erase effect. Effect does not erase intent. Both truths occupy space simultaneously. This is why family estrangement might be one of the most dimensionally layered experiences a consciousness can navigate in human form. It is not clean. It is not simple. It rarely contains a clear villain and victim. What it contains is misalignment, different emotional frequencies, different capacity for witnessing, different thresholds for what feels tolerable, different willingness to look at the patterns inherited across generations. And when those differences remain unaddressed across years, across decades, silence becomes the only language both can speak. But eventually, almost everyone traveling this path asks a question, even if only in the secret chambers of their own heart. Could this ever transform? Quantum mechanically, the answer has nothing to do with linear time. It has everything to do with pattern interruption. Without awareness, without reflection, without behavior that demonstrates change at the energetic level, time alone does not heal relational wounds. It only adds distance. And distance can either calcify into permanent separation or soften into possibility. That outcome depends on something very specific. Whether emotional safety becomes more sacred than being correct. Whether listening replaces defending. Whether curiosity replaces the need to control the other's experience. Because reconciliation, when it occurs in the quantum field, does not begin with contact. It begins with internal transformation, with the willingness to see what was previously invisible, with the courage to acknowledge impact regardless of intent. And for many beings, that transformation never arrives in this incarnation. So they learn to hold a reality that contains both peace and unresolved longing. A life where their nervous system finally knows rest, but their heart still carries questions. A life where they feel anchored in their own frequency, but sometimes sense the incompleteness of the story. And that contradiction is not weakness. It is the quantum nature of choosing self-preservation in a dimension that often rewards endurance over authenticity, performance over presence, loyalty over truth. After the silence settles into the bones, after the initial severance has moved from acute to chronic, something unexpected begins to alchemize. Many souls assume the most challenging terrain will be the separation itself, the conversations that end, the holidays that arrive empty of familiar voices, the phone that no longer carries certain names into their field. But psychologically, energetically, that is merely the surface layer of the transformation. The deeper work begins in the aftermath, when external noise fades and the internal cosmos grows louder. When family is no longer defining your frequency, correcting your choices, or projecting their unlived lives onto your path, a question emerges that can feel destabilizing. Who am I when no one is telling me who I should be? For so long, many beings unconsciously organize their identity around inherited roles. The responsible one who holds the family system together. The quiet one who absorbs everyone's overflow. The peacemaker who sacrifices their own needs to maintain false harmony. The difficult one who keeps telling the truth everyone else wants to keep buried. These roles are not chosen through free will. They are assigned in childhood, reinforced through repetition, anchored through subtle and overt energetic cues, and rarely questioned until the structure that sustained them collapses. When distance removes the architecture that kept those roles alive, the consciousness enters what depth psychologists call identity destabilization. Not a breakdown, a recalibration. A return to the original blueprint that existed before conditioning wrote its code over your essence. And it can feel profoundly disorienting. Souls describe it as standing in a space with no mirrors, no external reference points. There is relief, the relief of no longer performing, but also uncertainty. Because without constant feedback, even toxic feedback, the consciousness must learn to self-reference, to find north on its own internal compass. This is often when guilt intensifies, not because the decision was misaligned with truth, but because guilt is what remains when loyalty has nowhere to land. Guilt is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Frequently, it is evidence of conditioning. From a quantum psychological perspective, guilt thrives in systems where love was transactional, where approval came with terms and conditions, where belonging required the suppression of your authentic frequency. So when someone steps outside that system, even for their soul's survival, the emotional programming does not delete itself overnight. The mind whispers, "You broke the sacred rule," even when the rule was never sacred, even when the rule was suffocating your light. This is why beings can feel guilt even as they become calmer, healthier, more aligned with their truth than they have ever been. The nervous system relaxes into its natural state. The conditioned conscience protests. And this internal conflict can persist longer than expected, echoing across months, sometimes years. Research on energetic boundary setting shows that guilt often peaks not at the moment of separation, but during periods of expansion afterward, when beings start to genuinely thrive. Because thriving raises a question the mind has been avoiding. If I am flourishing now, why did I not honor myself sooner? That question carries shame, even though it should carry celebration. But shame is sophisticated. It disguises itself as responsibility, as evidence that you are a good person because you feel bad about choosing yourself. So beings replay the past, not to change it, but to punish themselves for having survived it. This is where self-compassion becomes not a spiritual platitude, but a neurological requirement. The consciousness cannot integrate trauma while simultaneously attacking itself for having limits. Studies demonstrate that individuals navigating family estrangement who cultivate self-compassion experience measurably lower anxiety, more stable emotional regulation, and a more coherent sense of identity across time. Not because they excuse harmful behavior, but because they stop treating their own boundaries as evidence of moral failure. Another profound shift occurs as time moves through the body. The nervous system begins to remember its organic state. Many souls do not realize how chronically activated they were until they are no longer existing inside constant vigilance, until their sleep deepens, until their thoughts slow their frantic pace, until their body stops bracing for the next energetic blow. This is not imagination. This is measurable biology. Chronic relational stress keeps the nervous system locked in a heightened state, flooding the body with cortisol, keeping the amygdala hyperactive, training the consciousness to scan every environment for threat. Distance, when it is the right medicine, allows the system to return to baseline, to remember what regulation feels like. And when the body feels safer, the mind follows. The heart opens cautiously. Creativity that was locked in survival mode begins to flow again. Beings start to experience something they may not have felt since childhood: emotional spaciousness. Room to think without immediately anticipating someone's reaction. Room to feel without minimizing or explaining. Room to exist without performing a version of themselves designed to keep others comfortable. And with that spaciousness comes the return of gifts that were buried under the weight of dysfunction. Curiosity, imagination, self-trust that does not require external validation, the capacity to take up space without apology. Not overnight, not in a linear path, but gradually, like spring arriving after a winter that lasted lifetimes. The quantum psychology of beings who sever family bonds is not, at its essence, about rejection. It is about resolution. The resolution to stop betraying your own soul in the name of a peace that was never peaceful. The resolution to choose energetic safety over the performance of connection. The resolution to live in alignment with truth, even when truth costs you proximity to those who gave you form. And perhaps the most important frequency we can transmit through this exploration is this: Most souls who walk this path never wanted to. They wanted authentic connection. They wanted repair that honored both parties. They wanted to be seen without having to shrink. Distance was not the destination. It was the consequence of clarity meeting resistance. And clarity, once it fully integrates, changes how a consciousness moves through all dimensions forever. Quieter, stronger, more rooted in the truth of who they came here to be. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. And in a universe built on frequencies, realness is the most powerful transmission that exists. If these words have resonated in the deep places of your being, I invite you to share this video with another soul who might need permission to choose themselves. Comment below about your own journey through these quantum territories. Let us create a field of witnessing for those who are still navigating the silence. And remember, you are not alone in this. You are part of an awakening that is rippling through collective consciousness. Your choice to honor your own frequency is helping to shift the entire field. Until we meet again in the space between words, may you know yourself as whole.